Can I welcome everyone back from the summer recess? And can I also welcome to the public gallery Jane Hutt AM, who's the Minister for Finance and Leader of the House in the Welsh Assembly Government. Welcome. I understand the Minister is meeting with the Cabinet Secretary and was keen to attend our meeting this morning, so I hope you find our work of interest. I'd like to remind everyone present to please turn off mobile phones, pagers and Blackberries. I'm just going to check that. Yes, I've definitely got mine off. And today we have received apologies from Gavin Brown, MSP. Agenda item 1, the first item on the agenda, is to decide whether to take items 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 in private. Are members agreed?
Something. I mean, some of us were talking about, in the early days of the Parliament, there was a presumption against taking things in private. We seem to, and it's not just this committee, but just generally, we seem to be sliding a bit into having quite a lot of items in private. And just wondered whether maybe things like work programmes, do we need to discuss those in private, or could we not put those on the record?
We'll understand that Labour members have been raising this across all committees, although we're 16 months into the session and no one has raised it prior to today at this committee. Jim?
Well, I mean, it's obviously it's a matter for the committee to decide whether to take items in private. Generally, though, as a rule, the reason that it's put forward as to be taken in private is to allow the clerks to provide frank advice in the accompanying papers. If the agenda items are taken in public, then the paper would be public as well. So, for example, issues like the suggestions for witnesses, etc. But it's really to allow the clerks to provide full and frank advice to the committee on work programme areas.
So without going into private session, it makes the clerk's job more difficult. There's also some of the papers which, frankly, we can't even discuss if they're not in private. For example, the paper on the Commonwealth Games, if we didn't discuss that in private, that would actually be withdrawn. We'd actually have to withdraw that fully from the agenda. So is there any items in particular that you feel we should not discuss in private?
I fully understand the issue of that particular issue. Obviously, it would have to be taken in. There's absolutely no way that could be taken in public. But I can recall a day when in 2000, the session in 2003, 2007, when even and it was members indeed of your own party who used to argue that discussion papers, reports of committees should be discussed in public. So it's a slight change of direction, say that even things like the work programme, and I think that's particularly around the work programme, there are issues which could be of public interest in terms of how the committees are considering generally going forward and the sorts of issues that they want to take up, and I think there is a degree of public interest in that.
Yeah, I think given the fact the Cabinet Secretary is waiting, Jim suggests we discuss this at the end of the meeting before we actually come to that item on the agenda. Would you be happy to accept that? And we can go on with the meat of it. Would you be happy with the other items that are on the agenda to be taken in private? Michael? Anyone else? Yeah, fine. Okay, we'll discuss that item when we come to it, and we won't keep our guests waiting any longer. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to invite you to make an opening statement, and before I do so, I'd also like to welcome Ailsa Brown and Sean Neal from the Scottish Government to committee.
Thank you, Convener, and I welcome this opportunity to discuss with the committee the progress that's been made by the Scottish Government on the arrangements for the implementation of the new financial powers under the Scotland Act. And there is, of course, a further agenda item that I'm here to discuss with the committee on the legislative consent motion, which will follow as a separate item. In relation to the implementation of the new financial powers, Convener, could I perhaps make 3 points at the outset of the discussions. Firstly, the additional responsibilities in the Scotland Act will be taken forward as part of our approach to demonstrate financial competence and effective delivery in all that the Government undertakes. We recognise that the Scotland Act has delivered additional responsibilities for the Parliament. The Government, of course, believes that more could have been achieved from the Scotland Act, but the approach that we will take to using the new devolved tax powers will be not only as a way of managing the public finances, but also to ensure that they help deliver sustainable economic growth. And that thinking has been implicit in the early publication of consultation documents around the land and buildings transaction tax that I published before the summer recess. We will therefore look to innovative ways to shape, deliver and collect these new taxes. There are a wide number of stakeholders who can help us with that. and active preparation and planning is essential to ensure that we can deliver, utilise and maximise the benefits from the new financial powers when they begin to come into force from April 2015. The second point, Convener, is that the Scottish Parliament will have a key role in oversight and assurance as we develop an approach to delivering these new financial powers. And I want to stress at the outset, Convener, my enthusiasm and equal anxiety to ensure that we engage properly with Parliament and with the committee about the way in which the government can fulfil the commitments that we have made in relation to the implementation of these responsibilities. For example, in the exchange of letters between Mr Crawford and the Secretary of State, we made clear the importance that we attach to consent and to parliamentary scrutiny of the approaches to consent on many of the implementation arrangements around the financial powers of the Scotland Act. I think it is important at the outset of this process that the committee and Parliament is fully involved in setting out its expectations of how it wishes to be involved in that process in order that the government can fulfil the commitments that we have made in our exchange of correspondence with the Secretary of State and in order to fulfil our commitments to Parliament in that process. So there are a number of areas where that needs to be established. It needs to be established around sufficient levels of assurance around the arrangements that have been put in place, around the operation of the budget setting process, which clearly will be different as a consequence of these matters, and that on the development of the policy approach to the implementation of any of these tax arrangements, that we have full sight of the interests and the perspectives of the committee and of Parliament. And of course, HMRC will also be involved in that process, which, although is a separate issue from the areas of responsibility for which I carry responsibility to the committee. The final area, Convener, is to reassure the committee that good progress has already been made in relation to the implementation of the provisions in the Scotland Act. As the committee will be aware, the government has published the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax consultation paper. The consultation for that closed on the 30th of August, and the consultation responses are now being assessed, and that will influence the shape of the bill that the government brings forward. And of course, the First Minister confirmed yesterday that that will be one of the bills the government introduces during this parliamentary year. We will consult on a landfill tax in the autumn, and there will be publication of that document relatively shortly, and we will of course engage fully on the questions around that. I set out to Parliament before the summer recess a clear perspective on the approach to establishing Revenue Scotland as a distinct tax administration function for assessing and collecting both the devolved taxes here in Scotland, and we are determined to ensure those operations are taken forward in an efficient and an effective fashion. I hope, Convener, that today's session marks the start of an extensive and constructive dialogue that will help us as we move forward with the implementation of the Scotland Act. We must use these powers and opportunities to reinforce the reputation that Scotland has for effective service delivery and financial management, and I look forward to working with the committee to provide Parliament and the committee with the necessary assurance around the implementation of these questions and the management of these functions, and I look forward to discussing those points with the committee this morning.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and I should apologise to Ian Gray, Convener of the Public Audit Committee, who is also here this morning. Sorry, Ian, I forgot to welcome you before we commenced. And Ian, of course, will be participating in the session this morning. The committee is aware that we're going to be the lead committee actually on the Scottish Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill, and also Landfill Tax Bill and Tax Management Bill, so we are going to be very much involved with you in terms of taking this whole area forward. I'm just wondering if you can talk for a wee bit about the establishment of Revenue Scotland. You wrote to me on the 30th of August about the establishment of Revenue Scotland, but I'm just wondering if, for the benefit of the committee, you can talk just a wee bit about that, please.
You'll recall, Convener, that I made a statement to Parliament before the summer recess, which essentially set out my intention to establish Revenue Scotland as a distinct tax administration and collection facility for the landfill tax and the land and buildings transaction tax. Essentially, I see Revenue Scotland operating very much in consort with established bodies who are already involved in the collection of some elements of the tax arrangements in these areas of policy. For example, Registers of Scotland are already part participants in the collection of stamp duty, and therefore what the role that I envisage for Registers of Scotland will be essentially to complete that process and to fully collect the revised land and buildings transaction tax that the government brings forward. So that will enable us within the confines of Registers of Scotland to establish the basis for collecting that particular taxation. As I say, some elements of the functions are already carried out by Registers of Scotland, and it enables us to complete that process. Similarly, in relation to landfill tax, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency is also involved in a significant amount of transaction collection in relation to collection of payments from particular organisations that have some liability for environmental charges, if I could use that terminology, and therefore extending their scope to take in the responsibilities around landfill tax appears a sensible and efficient way to proceed. The concept of Revenue Scotland essentially is to provide an overarching umbrella above that, which brings together all of these functions in a coherent and cohesive way. I see that as the efficient way to proceed because, for two reasons. Firstly, there is already part involvement by these organisations in the process of tax collection and organisation. And secondly, the comparative cost estimates that I have worked on based on this approach versus a maintenance of the status quo option, if I can call it that, by HMRC, comes out as a cheaper cost over the forthcoming years. The final point I would make in that brief introduction, Convener, is the fact that we have now appointed the first Director of Revenue Scotland, Eleanor Emberson, who is currently the Chief Executive of the Scottish Court Service, where Ms Emberson has established a very strong reputation for financial efficiency and effectiveness. She will join the government in this role on the 1st of October, but she will also assume wider responsibilities as Director of Financial Strategy within the Scottish Government in the early part of the new year, when the existing occupant of that post retires. So there will be a handover period in that respect.
Thank you very much. I mean, you did actually, talk about costs there, and you'll be aware that HMRC stated in written evidence to committee that the cost of implementing the Scottish rate of income tax is estimated at £45 million, with an annual operating cost of about £4.2 million. And I'm aware that the Scottish Government hoped that these costs could be shared, but that HMRC are of the view, and the UK Government is of the view, that the Scottish Government should bear all of those costs. I'm just wondering if you get any further indications of what these likely costs would be. I mean, are these figures accurate? And also whether or not there will be significant savings offset from ending their administration of stamp duty and landfill tax, which again you kind of touched on a bit earlier.
On your last point, Convener, about any financial benefit from the termination of stamp duty and landfill tax on a UK basis, if there is an administrative saving, the Secretary of State has confirmed that that would be passed to, essentially would be netted off in relation to costs of introducing the Scottish rate of income tax. Now, at this stage, we don't have any further information I can share with the committee on that point, but I think that the point of principle is a welcome point in relation to the offsetting of costs. In relation to the Scottish rate of income tax, which I would stress is a separate issue to the questions around Revenue Scotland, and the administration and organisation of the Scottish rate of income tax will continue to be exercised by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. There has been development work undertaken by my officials with HMRC and the Treasury on the Memorandum of Understanding to take forward the implementation arrangements around the Scottish rate of income tax. But I don't have any revised cost estimates beyond what were in the command paper that was published by Her Majesty's Government. Of course, when there is any further detail on that point, I will of course update the committee and be very happy to do so.
I mean, there's also the issue, of course, as we go forward of additional devolved taxes. I know that the Scottish Government are keen on the devolution of corporation tax, air passenger duty. Are there any other taxes which the Scottish Government are pursuing the devolution of at this time, or are considering looking to have devolved, assuming that we retain the devolution settlement going forward?
We have been involved, Convener, as you will know, in discussion with the UK Government around a range of points in connection with the contents of the Scotland Act, and of course we pressed for the devolution of a number of areas of taxation responsibility, a couple of which you have mentioned. We also pressed on the question of corporation tax into the bargain, and we pressed on issues in relation to the Crown Estate. Now, the UK Government has made clear its unwillingness to devolve those responsibilities. And perhaps, maybe not made it explicitly clear they're not prepared to do so, but I think implicitly they've made that clear by closing down the issues of consideration around the Scotland Act. So I think the questions on further tax devolution, I think, are somewhat embedded in the debate around the referendum, Convener, which will, of course, be taking place in 2014.
Thank you. Now, I'm very much aware that we're really tight for time today because we've got 3 evidence sessions today and 10 items on our agenda. Therefore, rather than do my usual and hog the limelight, I'm going to open things out just now to members of the committee. By Paul, Michael, John, Elaine.
Thank you, Convener. I have 2 areas that I would like to ask questions of your Cabinet Secretary, and welcome to the committee. The first is regarding the Holtham model. I just wondered whether you had any, to take this opportunity to explain to us whether you have any concerns about that in terms of how that will work, and you're satisfied that the Holtham model will protect the Scottish Government's budget from undue volatility in relation to tax revenues. And the second area, if I may, is just refer to, I think, some of the principles that are set out in the Joint Exchequer Committee regarding predictability. And given the uncertainty we have at the moment about exactly how much income tax is raised in Scotland, and obviously there will be evolution of the forecast methodology that will be deployed over time, do you have any concerns at this stage, at least, that you may have a risk of having difficulty in predicting what income tax receipts, given that you have to announce what the Scottish Government intends in terms of the SRIT rate to be applied by December, and yet obviously the UK Government may make changes to tax thresholds in March in its budget, and you have no knowledge of that in advance?
A number of points there. I suppose at the very outset of discussion of the Holtham methodology, I should pay tribute to my colleagues in Wales who have helpfully contributed this to the wider debate, and it's appropriate that my colleague and counterpart, the Finance Minister for Wales, is here to hear me say that. But the Holtham methodology, I think, is a welcome change from the provision that was implicit in the Calman recommendations, where the government was clearly concerned about the disadvantages that would emerge from the block grant adjustment mechanisms that were being talked about in the Calman methodology, which we considered would be damaging to the public finances of Scotland. The Holtham methodology essentially links the performance of the Scottish economy, to put a very complex piece of financial architecture into a slightly more straightforward context. It essentially links the Scottish tax base much more clearly with the economic performance of Scotland, and I think that's a very welcome connection to make, and an appropriate connection to make. The Holtham methodology does not, of course, remove the potential for volatility. I think that's an implicit part of the Scottish rate of income tax, that we accept that there is where we exercise a greater degree of financial control, there is over revenue-raising activity, there is a necessity to manage any volatility within those areas of taxation. That is why I argue, not surprisingly, for there to be a full range of taxation powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament, because that would enable us to essentially manage the differences and the changes between different elements of taxation. In dealing with any potential volatility around the Scottish rate of income tax, there is provision, of course, in the Scotland Act for the establishment of a cash reserve, which is there to essentially balance out some of the fluctuations that may exist in year-to-year taxation arrangements, and that is one tool that can be utilised in that respect. But I do come back to the point that if there is a desire, and this really answers the point at the heart of Mr. Wheelhouse's question, if we want to be in a position to manage the ebbs and the flows of taxation that happen on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis within public finances, as was seen by the Treasury in July in relation to tax collection, then having a broad range of tax powers to the disposal of the administration would be an effective way to take that forward. There is one element where we will have to be strengthening some of the work that we undertake, and that is, or not strengthening, just essentially developing new activities, is in relation to forecasting, because that will be an element that we have to be very confident about in relation to the judgments that have to be made in setting expectations around the Scottish rate of income tax and the wider budget setting process.
Thank you for that. I'll just restrict myself to one supplementary because I know other people are needing to get in. But in relation to the forecasting side of things, we're obviously the government expenditure revenue Scotland is the best we can do at the moment in terms of the data we have available to us. We've had discussions with Robert Choate from OBR about the sort of forecasting methodology and what they do in relation to the UK government's tax receipts and how they might evolve forecasts for the Scottish government. Are there steps that can be taken to do two things? One, to beef up the resource, if you like, that's available to either within the OBR or out with the OBR, but supporting the OBR's work to ensure that there are sufficiently robust forecasts for Scotland. And the second thing is in terms of some of the data that you rely on, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of making those judgments will be to do with GDP and other measures of economic performance, which tend to lag the UK figures in terms of their publication. I just wondered whether there's any steps that we can take either here in Scotland or through the offices of the ONS and OBR to speed up production of these data so you have them in more or less in real time, or at least on the same timescales as the UK government has.
On the question of the OBR, Mr. Wheelhouse, I'll appreciate that I have no operational jurisdiction over the OBR, but in terms of its responsibilities and its constitution, the OBR must be able, if it is being given a role within this whole process, to do an element of forecasting and estimating. The OBR must be satisfied that it has the capability and the effectiveness to do that effectively for Scotland. And I think, given the importance that is attached to these estimates, I would expect the OBR to indicate very clearly if it felt it either did not have the resources or the information or the quality of data to enable it to provide a quality piece of advice to the Scottish and United Kingdom governments. And the nature of the independent establishment of the OBR makes that an absolute requirement of the OBR. So I think I think that's a key point that has to be addressed by the OBR. The second point on statistics and the evidence base, clearly we are looking at all times to strengthen the statistical base within Scotland. Indeed, I think the committee has had discussions with the Chief Statistician on some of these points already, and the Chief Statistician is keen to advance on many of these questions as effectively as we can do. I don't feel that the information base at present would be a significant constraint on the activities that we undertake, but clearly that's a conditional view which is based on establishing, as we go through the process of working out detail around the Scottish rate of income tax and all that's associated with that, I will want to be satisfied that the quality of data available to us in these new areas of activity is sufficiently robust to enable me to provide assurance to Parliament on these questions, and that's an important caveat that I would insert into the process at this time.
Cabinet Secretary, do you have any concerns that since its establishment the OBR has consistently overestimated UK growth rates and the impact that if this continues, what that might have on Scotland?
I don't think the OBR has been alone in overestimating growth forecasts. If I can put it into some context, Convener, I think the growth forecasts have been higher than what has been the reality, which is a relationship that I think would certainly give me cause to think twice about some of the assumptions that have been made by the UK government around about the public finances. But clearly there is an element of forecasting that is now involved in a major part of the public finances of Scotland, and we have to. That's the caveat that I put into my answer to Mr. Wheelhouse a moment ago. We have to be very attentive to that detail to ensure that it properly reflects the impact that any errors that might emerge in relation to forecasting of revenues could have on the public finances of Scotland, which would be more significant after the implementation of the Scotland Act than they are today.
You're saying that they're not the only ones, but the day after we took evidence from the OBR, I met senior executives from the Royal Bank of Scotland who the OBR were saying that growth this year would be 0.8% and they said it would be 0.2%. And although even that seems now to be wildly optimistic, there seems to be a slight bias in favour of over-optimism in the OBR, which I think we have to be somewhat cautious about going forward.
I think the OBR is a relatively new concept. It's just about 18 months old, and I think we need to assess the effectiveness of the estimations that are being undertaken. But one of the points that I think the committee could helpfully consider is the extent to which the dialogue around how we provide assurance to the committee and to Parliament around the implementation of the Scotland Act provisions could be influenced by a broader understanding of a range of estimates around some of these points of detail to enable a broadly based view to be taken as we arrive at these important decisions. But that's clearly a matter for the committee to decide how it wishes to take forward those points.
Thank you. Michael, to be followed by John.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's not a dissimilar question, Cabinet Secretary, but it's maybe more about the practical aspect of the relationship between Revenue Scotland and HMRC. I'm sure you will be at great pains to avoid ever getting into a dispute with any department at Whitehall, but it might happen. Government happens that way sometimes, and you get disputes, you get disagreements. You might want a cohesive and cogent relationship, but it might not always function given the volatility, given some of the practicalities. Have you envisaged any areas where that might happen? Is there already an agreement in place over dispute resolution? Where is the backstop in terms of decisions in relation to if you can't agree on the collection and administration?
Not surprisingly, I suspect Mr McMahon's question gets to the nub of some of the sensitivities in all of this. So this isn't just I don't think this is just a Revenue Scotland HMRC question. It's essentially these issues are played out in the correspondence between Bruce Crawford and the Secretary of State as to how do we, and I think it's maybe best if I answer it in that context, how do we get to agreement on all of that? And I think helpfully and how the government was able to arrive at an agreement with the UK government on the implementation of the Scotland Act was essentially by the acceptance that the approach that we would take to reaching agreement would be consistent with the principles of the Statement of Funding Policy, which, if I could just remind the committee of them, are very broad. They cover accountability, autonomy, transparency, economic efficiency, stability and predictability, discipline, and crucially, consent. And the consent, if I could place on the record the consent terms, it says the system commands the support of governments, parliaments and people and is equitable and predictable in operation. I think I would labour the point of consent, that essentially what is in the nature of the exchange of correspondence between the Scottish Government and the UK Government is an importance of reaching joint agreement about these points. And I think that's very, very important. If there is a sense that something has been, let me put it, done to us, then it's not going to create an environment of agreement. So therefore, I think trying to make the process consistent with those principles, where we go through a good operational practice of evidence gathering, that we respect the decision-making of Parliament and the influence that Parliament comes to bear, that is an important element in how we formulate an agreement between the UK Government and the Scottish Government. Now, probably, I don't think I'm making any great revelation to Mr McMahon today. You know, most issues come down to money, and ultimately, the block grant adjustment mechanism will be a key feature in how these issues are resolved and how agreement is reached. So it may be that the committee wishes to spend some of its time, I'm only suggesting this, the committee may wish to spend some of its time considering how the block grant adjustment mechanism might operate, in order that that could advise and influence the debate and have an influence on the Scottish Government and what we take to that discussion with the UK Government. And I offer that as a suggestion, but I would certainly find that helpful in allowing me to fulfil my duty to give Parliament assurance. If I know what Parliament is kind of looking for, it gives me a better sense of what I can perhaps achieve in negotiation with the United Kingdom Government. So the nature of the discussion that we had with the UK Government was about how could we construct a process that was trying to arrive at agreement. I readily accept there is a fair point to be asked about what happens if you can't get agreement, and I suppose what I would say to that is that there are well-established dispute resolution mechanisms within the interplay between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, as there are between all the devolved administrations and the UK Government, which we've tested on one occasion, which got to a satisfactory conclusion. One other point to add into that is specifically on the relationship with HMRC. There is work being done at official level on the construction of a memorandum of understanding between the Scottish Government and HMRC, which actually involves yes, the Scottish Government and the HMRC, which by extension involves the UK Government into the bargain, about how we will go around much of this detailed operational work. And of course that will help in providing some further process to assist agreement.
Helpful, Convener. The reason why I was asking the question was to see if there was still work to be done and whether there was any scope for us to look at that. And I think the Cabinet Secretary's suggestions.
On the substance of this, I've been given some thought to, and committee will tell me when it's appropriate for me to mind my own business. But I've been given some thought to how I fulfil my duty in the agreement we've reached with the UK Government to assure Parliament of the nature of the agreement. And I think the more I can have a strong sense of what Parliament expects of ministers in that process, long before we get involved in that discussion, the better, in terms of enabling me to fulfil my duty to Parliament in that respect.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Elaine.
Thanks. I think there was a very positive reaction when you set out earlier on the kind of principles of a Scottish tax system, because although we're actually only introducing two relatively small new Scottish taxes, they are the first ones and will presumably set a kind of precedent for the way ahead. I mean, I'm wondering, how much do you think we can do it a little bit differently, and especially the kind of whole idea of simplicity, getting people to understand taxes more? Because, I mean, Westminster system has been widely criticised for being so complex. They bring in rules, there's avoidance, there's more rules, there's more avoidance. Can we avoid going down that route?
I think the point that Mr Mason makes at the outset is an important point, that there are, we should have a clear sense of what is the scope of what we can do here. We have essentially two tax provisions that we can change the character of those if we choose to do so, on land and buildings transaction tax as a replacement for stamp duty and the landfill tax. And what I tried to do in my statement back in June was to set out the principles that we would apply to taking forward this activity, that the taxes would be proportionate to ability to pay, there would be certainty for the taxpayer, there would be convenience and ease of payment, and there would be efficiency. And those 4 points in principle essentially emerged from the thinking of Adam Smith. Now, I've tried to apply those in the land and buildings transaction tax, and I will be doing exactly the same in relation to landfill tax. And I think Mr Mason fairly characterises the reaction, that I think the response from a range of different stakeholders has been broadly positive around the nature of the proposals that we have put forward, of moving away from a slab tax to a more progressive tax, which essentially fulfils the commitment of proportionate to ability to pay. Now, I'm anxious that, and the guidance that I have given to officials is that we are going into this process to use every opportunity to simplify the process. That must be an advantage of having control over these responsibilities. So I do think there is more we can do by linking Registers of Scotland to the collection and administration of land and buildings transaction tax, and linking SEPA to the landfill tax. These are organisations that are already in that space, so therefore linking these tax provisions to the wider responsibilities and competences of these organisations strikes me as a way of making it easier for consumers to relate to these tax provisions. So that will be one of the principles that we take forward as part of this discussion, and I'm very keen to involve, and we have involved over the summer, a range of professional organisations, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, an organisation of which Mr Mason may actually even be a member, I think. I'll clarify his declaration of interests on his behalf. The Law Society of Scotland, the Chartered Institute of Taxation. And I think these organisations certainly have provided a very helpful input into how some of those aspirations that Mr Mason has talked about would assist in the process.
Okay, Elaine, to be followed by Mark.
It's accepted that obviously that the introduction of the new financial powers will require some changes to the Scottish budget process, and changes which will be agreed with committee in due course. We've had some preliminary discussions within the committee about how we might see that going forward. And I wondered if you'd had any thoughts about how you see the budget process within the Scottish Parliament changing as a result of these powers, and bearing in mind, of course, that people are always a great deal more interested in budgets when it involves what they're paying in taxes as well as how the money is being spent.
I think the consideration, in a sense, I should caveat what I say by saying that I'm very much in Parliament's hands on this point, and what I would make clear is the willingness of my officials to work very constructively with the committee, its clerks and its advisor, to test out ways in which the budget process can be revised to take account of the new responsibilities that we will have. I suppose the key consideration is that we have to be able to synchronise all of the input information, if I can call it that, of what revenue we expect when we are going through the budget setting process. So if I use a parallel of where we are just now, when I set an annual budget, I make I declare my expectation of non-domestic rates income, for example, and then I essentially have to guarantee that. that is important as a declaration because it forms part of the overall financial envelope that the government is distributing to the range of different public services that we can support. So I think it's important that whatever other inputs of income we have coming into the budget process, they have to be synchronised to make sure that a complete picture is being set out to Parliament. And crucially, that we can have confidence around the estimates that are being made of the provisions that are emerging as a consequence of the budget details. So those would, I think, ensuring that we have a process that can give Parliament at the outset and the start of the budget process the complete picture of information that Parliament gets at the start of a budget process today strikes me as the key part of what needs to be fulfilled. In terms of the scrutiny process, I would say, my impression, certainly sitting here, is that the scrutiny process of Parliament is very comprehensive around budget provisions, both at subject committee level and in its summary form when it comes to the Finance Committee before we move into the consideration within the Chamber at stages 1 and 3 of the budget process. So it doesn't strike me as being further opportunities for scrutiny that are required. I think that process is pretty well established, but making sure that there is synchronised information and complete information available to Parliament, despite the fact that, going back to Mr Wheelhouse's point, there may be certain questions about the predictability of that information, is the area that we need to make sure is correct.
Okay, Mark, to be followed by Ian.
Thank you, Convener. Interested about the issues around landfill tax. I know the Scottish Government has indicated its intention to replace landfill tax, and there's going to be a consultation on that. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary might be willing to share some of his early thinking on where he sees that going.
The key consideration I have here is that the landfill tax must effectively and implicitly support the very good progress that is being made in relation to encouraging the improvement in recycling activity within Scotland as we move towards the zero waste objective. So the key consideration that that I have is that we establish that linkage and that we ideally find ways of incentivising further improvements in that practice and in that process, which I think is possible to be achieved. And of course, there are a wide range of stakeholder interests within Scotland that I think can help us with thinking through some of the opportunities that exist in that respect.
But by way of background, before being elected to Parliament, I served as chair of an environmental organisation who were in receipt of landfill tax funding. I know it's currently administered via a UK-wide body, Entrust. Does the Cabinet Secretary envisage something similar being replicated in Scotland, or has he not given that the level of detailed consideration at this stage?
It's an issue very much under consideration in the formulation of the consultation document. I recognise the very good work that has been undertaken over it must be a 15-year period, I would think, of the implications of the Landfill Communities Fund, and we would be seeking to encourage a continuation of that activity. Whether there's a better and more effective way to do it is not a point that we've concluded on, nor will we conclude on that until after the consultation document has been issued and submissions made. But I do see that as an essential element of the whole approach to delivering the zero waste agenda, which the government is determined to secure.
Convener, the Audit Committee, as might be expected, has begun to take an interest in the audit and accountability arrangements around the new tax powers that we've been discussing. And perhaps particularly around the Scottish rate, the rate of Scottish income tax, given that that involves HMRC, which is a body that this Parliament normally has a role in auditing. And I think the committee may be a little concerned when they heard HMRC say in evidence to this committee, as the Scottish rate is part of the UK income tax system, it will be difficult to separate accountability for one aspect of the delivery of the income tax system from the rest, because I think the view of the committee would be that there does have to be some separation of accountability so that both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament can reassure themselves that Scottish taxpayer funding spent by HMRC in operating the system.
Crime has been reported in the building. While this is being investigated, please stay where you are and await further instructions. May I have your attention, please?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to suspend the session.
While this is being investigated, please stay where you are.
was and cut to the question, given we've lost so much time. Cabinet Secretary, you've talked a number of times about the work that's ongoing in developing the Memorandum of Understanding with HMRC, and my question, I think, is what progress has been made and what are your aspirations around the arrangements for audit and transparency, the relationship between NEO, the Scottish Government and indeed this Parliament? What kind of arrangements would you like to see to ensure transparency for the operation of the Scottish income tax?
I think there's a number of points to answer Mr Gray's question, and I think let me start with the reference I made when I was dealing with Mr McMahon's question to the Secretary of State's letter, where the principles of the approach that are to be taken forward are to be consistent with the principles set out in the Statement of Funding Policy, which, as I said to Mr McMahon, encompasses a whole range of different factors, but principle in relation to the points that Mr Gray is raising are the points of accountability and transparency and consent, which I think have relevance to this point. So I would be wanting to construct an approach which was consistent with those principles. The second point is, I think, in what we have now begun to discuss within the Joint Exchequer Committee, and the Secretary of State and I supplied the committee with the papers and minutes from the previous meetings. And if I go to the minutes of the Joint Exchequer Committee on the 18th of June, which were supplied to the committee just yesterday, there's a number of points that the committee noted, one of which is that the accountability of HMRC would be enhanced by the appointment of the additional HMRC accounting officer who would be responsible for the Scottish rate. The role of this individual in reporting to the Scottish Parliament and its committees was intended to be directly analogous to the role of HMRC's principal accounting officer in respect of the UK Parliament and its committees. Now, I think that's a very significant commitment, because it then takes me really on to my third point, which is to sort of suggest to Mr Gray, in the way that I've suggested to the Finance Committee, that the Public Audit Committee, I think, needs to be forming its expectations of what would be acceptable to the Public Audit Committee in this process. There will be a certain amount of assurance that I require from HMRC, because I will be dependent on HMRC for information, for collection capability, for a whole variety of different elements of this.
Attention please, attention please. The fire emergency is now resolved. Please return to your normal activities. Thank you for your cooperation.
I'm sure that will make a fascinating addition to the official report.
Thank you very much for your cooperation.
I look forward to those words being ascribed to the source of the. Maybe it gets put down in the official report as the overhead.
More difficult committee appearance in the future, I would have thought.
As Mr Gray correctly says, I've had somebody nudging the fire alarm system in other parts of the building. But to be serious, the final point is I think is the important point, which is that I will have requirements as the Finance Minister to be assured of a variety of different issues from HMRC's performance in the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax and all the arrangements that go with that. But equally, the Public Audit Committee and the Finance Committee must be fully and properly assured by those arrangements into the bargain. So I think we would be well served to develop an approach which is consistent with those points in the Statement of Funding Policy, and to ensure that the aspirations of the parliamentary committees are properly taken into account. In that respect, my officials and my approach will be to work very much with the committee in that respect.
Of course. I think that's extremely helpful, and certainly I'll discuss with the committee the suggestion that we might be able to make our suggestions as to what we think would be acceptable. I just wonder what the kind of timescale then for that is around the negotiation of the memorandum. I mean, obviously, once that's agreed, it would be more difficult to input to it.
Well, the work is going on, the Memorandum of Understanding just now. It's not come to me yet. So, in a sense, I'd be very happy at this stage for the committee and its clerks to talk to my officials about these points. Very happy to facilitate those discussions. And then clearly, once the as part of the assurance process, before I sign off a Memorandum of Understanding, I have to be confident that it's, because ultimately it will be a Memo of Understanding for me to sign off. I have to be confident that I'm fulfilling my duty to Parliament in the fashion that I spoke to Mr McMahon about earlier on, that what I've signed up to Parliament and committees are going to be broadly comfortable with. So I think the earlier we have that dialogue, the better.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and that appears to have exhausted the questions from committee members. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues for coming to committee. I'm not going to suspend the session, but I will allow 45 seconds for a change of witnesses. Well, that change in witnesses was very smoothly done. So we now move on to agenda item 3, which is the second of our 2 sessions with the Cabinet Secretary and our consideration of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill Legislative Consent Memorandum. Accompanying the Cabinet Secretary are Dr Linda Pooley and Stuart Fubister from the Scottish Government. I again invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement explaining the Legislative Consent Memorandum.
Convener, can I thank the committee for providing the opportunity to discuss the provisions of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill. The vast majority of the provisions within the bill are reserved to the UK Government. However, Part 1 of the bill makes provision about the Green Investment Bank, and the clauses in that part, other than Clause 6 dealing with the laying of documents before the Westminster Parliament, fall within the legislative competence of this Parliament insofar as they extend to Scotland. The provisions in that part allow Her Majesty's Treasury to give the Green Investment Bank financial assistance as long as it is more than half owned by the Crown and as long as 2 further conditions are met. These conditions are that the Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skills has provided the Green Investment Bank with an operational independence undertaking, and that the Constitution of the Green Investment Bank allows it to engage only in activities that contribute to the achievement of one or more of the green purposes in the UK. The green purposes of the Green Investment Bank are defined as being the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the advancement of efficiency in the use of natural resources, the protection or enhancement of the natural environment, the protection or enhancement of biodiversity, and the promotion of environmental sustainability. These are areas where Scotland has considerable policy responsibility and that are priority areas for the Scottish Government. These green purposes complement one another and have a broad reach across the low-carbon agenda. Ministers welcome the fact that they are in the bill and that they will underpin the operational decision-making within the institution. I should also mention briefly that the provisions in the bill that relate to the Green Investment Bank do not control board or other appointments, set its location or set out any expectations for how it will operate financially in terms of any borrowing powers or financial products it must offer. These matters will be dealt with through the corporate governance procedures. Ministers are content that Part 1 of the bill will ensure the Green Investment Bank has a low-carbon focus at the heart of its operation. Furthermore, the Scottish Government believes the creation of the Green Investment Bank will prove to be a beneficial tool in the efforts to improve the investment landscape in our low-carbon economy, and therefore welcome the initiative. For this purpose, Ministers were content to free up £103 million of the fossil fuel levy monies to contribute to the initial £3 billion capital of the Green Investment Bank. We agreed to this because we are confident that Scotland's low-carbon sector is at the forefront of demonstrating the economic case for green growth and will be in a position to present investment-ready projects suitable for Green Investment Bank support. The Green Investment Bank will potentially bring much-needed investment where market failures have held the sector back. In addition, the announcement in March 2012 that Edinburgh had been chosen as the base for the Green Investment Bank headquarters with a transactions team based in London was great news for the city and a ringing endorsement of Scotland's leading place in the UK's green economy. The manner in which Scottish commercial, academic and civic society, including all parties in this Parliament, came together to support Edinburgh's bid was evidence of the consensus of opinion that Scotland is well placed to be at the centre of the shift to a low-carbon economy. Scottish ministers believe, therefore, it is sensible that the provisions in this bill relating to the establishment of the Green Investment Bank and its green purposes should be considered by the UK Parliament on the basis that there is no evident benefit in separate legislation which would add unnecessary cost and delay. I therefore ask the committee to support the draft legislative consent motion that's been laid before it.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and like all our MSPs, I welcome the establishment of the Green Investment Bank in Edinburgh. I do have a couple of questions, though. One is, I do have concerns, though, that under the bill, the Green Investment Bank won't be able to borrow until debt is falling as a percentage of GDP, and that delay and restriction will damage the ability of the Green Investment Bank to leverage investment from the private sector. I'm just wondering whether the Scottish Government has made any representations on that particular issue to the UK Government.
The question of borrowing is one, obviously, that we are materially absorbed with the UK Government, and our view has been that in the wider economic debate, that there is an argument for a level of discrete borrowing to support capital investment that can support economic growth. Now, that's a kind of core line of argument that the government has made to the UK Government, given the current economic circumstances. We are involved in active discussion with the UK Government around the composition and operations of the Green Investment Bank, and clearly the question of borrowing is one that the UK Government has made clear its position on, but we would be happy to, as part of the wider representations we make about the importance of having an effective level of borrowing to support capital investment in our economy, to make those points to the UK Government.
Thank you, that's much appreciated. There's one other issue I want to raise, which is that the focus of the Green Bank will be on, as I understand it, on offshore wind, non-domestic energy efficiency and waste. It doesn't seem to include a focus on tidal and wave energy, and I think, given that Scotland's leading the world in some of these technologies, I think that's an opportunity missed. Once again, is that something that the Scottish Government would be prepared to raise with the UK Government in terms of this legislation?
I think the UK Government has spelt out at the outset the areas of active interest for the Green Investment Bank, and its activities are about encouraging investment in particular sectors. Now, I think to be fair in this process, although these areas of activity have been set out, they've not been set in stone for all time, and there is an explicit acceptance that the areas of focus will develop as the Green Investment Bank develops its operations. I think what we've got to make sure is that, and I'm aware of the concern around the marine sector, that we put in place effective support for the development of the marine sector. And if I look at what the Scottish Government is doing through, I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the £103 million of fossil fuel levy money that has gone into the Green Investment Bank, well, there's another £103 million is coming into renewable investments within Scotland, which will add to the £200 million already budgeted for in the 3-year spending review for renewables. So I think and a lot of that, I suspect, will end up in the direction of the marine sector as we try to develop those capabilities of new devices and products. So I think in that context of finance being available through these channels, and then also other supports being available through the Green Investment Bank, perhaps in the medium term and not the short term, I think there is an acceptable way forward for the marine renewable sector. But we will continue to have dialogue with the UK Government about what's the right focus for the Green Investment Bank, and would want to make sure that the clear capability and potential of the marine sector in Scotland is fulfilled by this investment programme.
Thank you. I'm going to open the session out to questions from members, and it'll be Paul to followed by Elaine.
Thank you, Convener. You've covered, Convener helpfully covered some of the things I was going to cover, but there's one issue that was raised with me by WWF in a briefing that they'd sent to members of the UK Parliament in relation to the bill around the area of the green purposes, and they raised a concern about the advancement of efficiency in the use of natural resources, which is one of the second purpose that's listed under the green purposes. And their concern was that it might be used to justify perhaps more efficient use of fossil fuels, but nevertheless it might be used as a justification for investment by the Green Investment Bank in perhaps fossil fuel technology, either coal-fired or nuclear, or indeed what they would regard as unsustainable biofuels. I just wondered whether you could comment on that rather than expressing an opinion myself. I just wondered whether you had a comment on that concern.
I think it's, I recognise the sensitivity there. I think it's important not to view these green purposes in compartments. They have to be viewed together. And if I look to other points, there is a purpose of the protection or enhancement of the natural environment, or the promotion of environmental sustainability, or the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think I quite understand the sensitivity of considering that within a compartment, but I think considered in the round, I think the green purposes I think give effective clarity of what would be a reasonable set of activities for the Green Investment Bank to be involved in.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Elaine?
Thanks very much, Convener. You've also covered some of the points I wanted to raise, but can I just preface it by saying that in agreeing to the LCM on the Green Investment Bank does not imply any agreement with certain other aspects of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill, which certainly some of us in the committee would find quite offensive and would oppose. So just to make that quite clear, can I just ask whether you have had any assurances from the UK government in the event of constitutional reform post-2014, whether or not the headquarters of the bank will remain within Edinburgh?
First point to say is just on the point that Dr Murray raises about the scope and the extent of the bill, that I quite acknowledge the point that she makes, and I was very clear in my own contribution that there is the issues that are at stake here for the Scottish Government are essentially in the Part 1 provisions in relation to the Green Investment Bank, so there's no question of further consideration has been applied in that respect. On her other point, there have been no discussions with the UK Government on that question.
Questions from colleagues? Okay, now the committee has to report to Parliament on its views on the LCM, and I'm just wondering, are there any particular issues which members wish to raise in the report, or are they content for it to simply refer to the official report of this evidence session? People happy with the official report? Okay, members have indicated that they agree that the official report will suffice, and therefore are members content with the terms of the legislative consent memorandum and to report accordingly? Okay, agreed. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the witnesses for their attendance today, and I'll now suspend the session until 11:25. Actually in position, so we'll just start 1 minute earlier than I'd previously suggested, given the fact that we still have a fairly packed agenda. So on agenda item 4, we now turn to the first of 4 oral evidence sessions which the committee will have on its Stage 1 scrutiny of the Freedom of Information Amendment Scotland Bill. We will today take evidence from the Scottish Government Bill team, and I can now therefore like to welcome to the meeting Zoe Mockery, Heike Stevenson and Andrew Gunn. And I'd like to invite a member of the Bill team to make an opening statement.
Okay, thank you very much. The Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002 is widely regarded as being an effective piece of legislation setting rigorous standards for public authorities to follow in responding to requests for information. It has been recognised by Scotland's first Information Commissioner as being strong and withstanding international scrutiny. The former Commissioner also considered the law to be progressive, with authorities complying with their obligations and the public making widespread use of their FOI rights. The Act has been in operation for over 7 years, and in this relatively short period has been successfully established as integral to the day-to-day business of public authority administration, and has resulted in more information being made public in the interests of accountability and transparency. However, while the Act is generally considered effective, weaknesses have been identified, primarily around the inflexibility of the order-making power with regard to revising the lifespan of exemptions, and also in the inability to bring a prosecution. Therefore, while generally small scale, the key amendments in the bill will pave the way for more information to be made publicly available earlier, and for a prosecution to be brought in the event of information subject to request being deliberately destroyed or concealed with a view to preventing disclosure. 2 other amendments, one adding clarity, another increasing protection for personal data, are taken from the special report presented to Parliament by the former Information Commissioner. We anticipate taking forward other recommendations contained in the report by means of guidance or the statutory code of practice. The limited scale of the bill is in line with the second of the Scottish Government's 6 principles of freedom of information, set out in June 2007, which commits the government to adjusting the regime where it is necessary and sensible to do so. It is perhaps also worth noting that in its recent report following post-legislative scrutiny of the UK Freedom of Information Act, the House of Commons Justice Committee made very few recommendations for revision, and indeed several of those recommendations would bring the UK legislation more into line with the Scottish Act. For example, in terms of setting statutory timescales and treatment of research material. To some extent, this reflects the close relationship these 2 pieces of legislation have always had. When the initial Freedom of Information Bill was being debated, emphasis was put on the need for general compatibility between the separate regimes. The same arguments would seem to apply today, for example, in ensuring consistency of approach to information relating to communications with Her Majesty, given the commonality of the position of the monarch as shared head of state. The bill specifically does not address the question of extension of coverage. Extension has been subject to consultation, and Scottish ministers are clear that a decision is deferred until Parliament has considered the amendment bill. The power to extend is already contained within the legislation, and as such, it would not seem to be in the spirit of the original Act to now extend coverage by means of primary legislation. Finally, the bill, as well as the anticipated secondary legislation resulting in more information being made public, also forms one of the legislative strands of the Scottish Government's developing transparency agenda. Consultation on this, in the form of initial engagement with stakeholders, is anticipated for later this year, as the government seeks to promote greater openness and accountability across the wider public sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to say it's most frustrating when one wades through such a mountain of information to realise almost every question that one wanted to ask is really answered in all the documents that are actually provided. It seems inverse that the more work you put into reading documents, the less you then find you have to ask because so many questions are already answered. But I will try nonetheless. I'm sure colleagues will do likewise. Obviously, the issue of communication with Her Majesty is a key point in this legislation, and you talked about the Scottish Government mirroring the kind of UK's position. What's your view, though, on the fact that the bill passed through its stages, for example, in the House of Lords within 3 days, and in a timescale which one would suggest does not normally provide enough scrutiny? How do you feel that has impacted upon the legislation which we are effectively hoping in this aspect to mirror?
It's a difficult question to answer, but I would hope that the Scottish Parliament is given ample opportunity to scrutinise the provision, unlike our equivalents south of the border. There was much criticism made of the speed of introduction, with the late introduction of the Royal Amendment. I think it's a reasonable amendment, and our intention is to ensure a consistent approach across the United Kingdom for information of similar types. And hopefully you'll have sufficient time to explore quite how that will operate.
Yes, indeed. It's just because we're building on legislation already there, and effectively, you know, that's why I kind of asked that question. In terms of some of the evidence we've given, Unison raised concerns about the application of the public interest test. Now, the documents have provided an answer, but again, for the record, can you advise why, in terms of the communication with Her Majesty, the Bill team do not believe there is a public interest in terms of the monarch, the heir to the throne, and the second in line?
The proposed change ensures that the long-standing constitutional convention surrounding the monarchy and its records is upheld. Ministers don't believe that the Freedom of Information Scotland Act was intended to supersede those long-standing conventions. The issue of public interest is, by its nature, a subjective test. And it's difficult to see how one would be able to appropriately apply that test against the Constitutional Convention and the monarch's duty and right to counsel and warn and advise her ministers.
Okay. Now, when we actually look at the regulations and the definition of Scottish public authorities, it appears that the Environmental Information Scotland Regulations 2004 actually provide, you know, a wider definition, a much wider definition than actually this legislation will. Can you explain why that would be and why you have decided on the definitions that contained?
It's partly a matter of the origins of the two different regimes. The Environmental Information Regulations implement a European directive, and you're quite right to note that there isn't a protection in there for communications with the monarch. There is, though, that protection in Freedom of Information Scotland Act, and we think it's reasonable to ensure that the confidentiality of communications with the Royal Household is upheld through this Act.
And can you talk a wee bit about the flexibility, you know, in terms of the timescales whereby the Act would actually operate over? Because quite a lot of the people in evidence have given different views as to, you know, whether it should be the 30 years, as is the moment, or 15 years, or there should be flexibility. Can you talk a wee bit about your thinking on that particular issue?
The consultation responses, exactly as you say, have indicated a varying approach to exemptions. The problem that the consultation, the 2009 consultation, threw up was that it's really one size does not fit all kind of approach. Obviously, at the moment, the 30-year rule, as it were, covers 8 exemptions, but in wanting to reduce the lifespan of those exemptions, there are sensitivities around certain classes, certain categories of information, such as commercial sensitivity, such as confidentiality, The Act obviously does not contain the power at the moment to take an exemption by exemption approach. So we're hoping to get the power to be able to do that. Although obviously the stated position of the government is that we will reduce the majority of exemptions to 15 years, but maintain protection for confidentiality and, in the particular circumstances, regarding the royal communications.
You talked about in your opening statement about prosecution and the current bill not really having enough leeway to enable such prosecutions. Over the period of the bill's enactment, have there been many instances when you would like to take prosecutions forward but have been able to do so because of this?
I think this is possibly something you might want to ask the Information Commissioner when you take evidence next week, but as far as we understand from her, there have been, I think, 7 occasions where there has been potentially sufficient evidence to proceed with a prosecution, but because of the current time bar, effectively the 6-month time bar, it has not been possible to pursue those further.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open things out to other members of the committee, and the first question will be Mark, to be followed by Paul.
Thank you, Convener. It's just a very brief question. As you say, a lot of the questions which members might have had appear to have been addressed. I'm given to understand that if the changes that are being proposed by this bill had been in place at the initial onset of freedom of information, then there would only have been one freedom of information request that would have been impacted by those changes in terms of the restrictions that are being explored. Is that correct?
I mean, in terms of the royal exemption?
Yeah.
I believe it's one Scottish Government request, but I couldn't speak for the wider range of bodies that are covered by the Act.
Okay, thanks for that.
Sorry, I didn't notice that Elaine had indicated she wanted to speak before Paul, so Elaine, to be followed by Paul.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to explore the issue of the extension of coverage, because in the way I understood your argument, that the argument is that it's not necessary to look at that within the context of this legislation because it could be covered by secondary legislation. Is there not also, however, an argument that though it could be quite controversial, the level of consultation is much higher when it comes to primary legislation, so that there could be a case for including this in primary legislation in order to enable that degree of consultation with the bodies which might be affected. I mean, it seems slightly strange to me, for example, that a council housing department, which is supported by tenants' rent and by support from Scottish Government, is subject to FOI, whether they're a registered social landlord who in fact may have received stock from the council, again supported by tenants' rents and support from the Scottish Government, is not subject to FOI, and tenants are reliant on what the regulator is prepared to publish in regard of their inquiry. So is it just a technical issue that means that we're not looking at extension at this point? Is it likely that we are going to see secondary legislation looking at consultation, at extension, sorry?
I don't think there's certainly been no lack of consultation on extension of coverage going back several years. I think Scottish ministers are anxious to take a proportionate approach to the question. Obviously, the power to extend coverage is already in the Act, and the provision is there in order to extend coverage. So it wouldn't seem in the spirit of the original legislation to use primary legislation, obviously, to put into practice the power that's already there. There are clearly anomalies in the situation, but the position of Scottish ministers is clear that we have consulted and that a decision will be deferred until, it's a sequential issue, until Parliament has considered the amendment bill. I think it's also important to put a bit of context in this as well. Extension is sometimes seen as a be-all and end-all, but there are other means of acquiring information from bodies who aren't covered. And obviously the wider transparency agenda, the wider transparency picture, is intended to cater for that, for example, through the Scottish Housing Charter, which is opening up routes to information. It's not extension, but it's another route to access information.
I think the point really about primary legislation is that it's subject to a degree of parliamentary scrutiny, which secondary legislation is not. So if an issue where organisations may have concerns about extension, that primary legislation actually gives a better opportunity for discussing their concerns.
I think, well...
I mean, it's maybe an unfair question because it's really a policy issue, a practical issue.
Well, it is a policy issue. We've got the Minister next week, but obviously we've been through consultation. There are business regulatory impact assessments undertaken, and the current position is clear in that the decision will be deferred.
Okay, thank you. Paul, to be followed by John.
Convener, I was welcome to the committee. I was just wanting to refer to something which was mentioned in the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Chief Whip's letter to the committee convener, which related to the procurement reform bill. And one of the concerns there has been from the wider public is about the lack of access to, on the same basis, to private sector organisations in terms of Freedom of Information Act. And what the Minister says that he would urge the committee to consider the very real impact that procurement reform could have on the availability to the public, as well as to the private sector, of information relating to public sector spending. So I regard that in terms of public contracts to private sector organisations and opening that up to establish more transparency. I just wondered whether you could give the committee any sort of feel as to how the government bill team sees the interaction between what you're proposing under this proposal and what's happening with procurement reform to sort of open up and make more transparent the relationship between government, public sector and these private sector organisations where there obviously is a public interest in what happens.
Well, obviously at the moment I think we're only at the consultation stage on the procurement reform bill. There will be obviously ongoing contact between officials in order to incorporate elements of transparency within the procurement reform bill. Again, going back to the previous answer, we see this as forming part of the wider transparency agenda. Obviously, there are already freedom of information clauses in contractual arrangements at present, so it's not as if information isn't accessible. Is also the case that the Public Records Bill is putting in place structures and records management policies which are increasing access to private contractual information. So it's a multi-strand approach which the Procurement Reform Bill will form an element of. But there are discussions to be had, I think.
I suppose that so you're highlighting it's part of a wider programme of transparency, but just to pick up on Dr Murray's point about sort of, consultation and sort of primary legislation, and that you have obviously got an opportunity with the Procurement Reform Bill to have quite extensive consultation and open discussion in the appropriate committee about that issue as it relates to the private sector organisations that are contracting with the public sector. So that maybe is an opportunity where we can open that discussion out.
I certainly think that is recognised as being an opportunity as the transparency agenda on which we are committed to consulting and certainly envisage stakeholder engagement later this year as we are committed to taking forward. So that's one element of that agenda.
Thank you very much.
Deputy Convener.
Thanks, Convener. To start with the Royal Family, I think the point was made elsewhere that in some of the comments that in other parts of legislation, the kind of privilege or whatever you want to call of the Royal Family is gradually being reduced. And I mean, I find it to say that it's a long-standing convention. Well, I mean, this Parliament is not afraid of changing long-standing conventions. So why is it in this area, when other areas are becoming more relaxed about the Royal Family, why is it this area we've got to be so protective?
I think it's about equality of treatment under the two regimes that operate in the United Kingdom. As Andrew said earlier, there's always been a degree of complementarity between the Scottish Act and the UK Act on areas of common interest. but it's considered advisable to ensure cross-border cooperation exemptions in the Scottish legislation were intended to be compatible with the relevant provisions in the UK Freedom of Information legislation. Ministers believe that the same argument applies to the commonality of the shared monarch.
But why is the monarch being treated differently? Because, I mean, charities, we treat charities differently in Scotland and England, even though sometimes they're the same charities. So why the fear of treating the monarchy differently?
The monarchy occupy a unique position in British life. The monarch is appointed for life and has the right and duty to counsel her ministers, her government, and that includes the Scottish ministers and the Scottish government as much as the UK ministers and government.
Okay. Secondly, the point's made that the voluntary sector may be reluctant to use freedom of information legislation because it would affect the relationship with the person they're asking for the information from. I mean, in one sense, is that just something we cannot do anything about? Because whatever the legislation is, they might be afraid to use it.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend, and we're not quite sure why voluntary organisations are so reluctant to make use of the legislation. It's useful that the Commissioner's Office are undertaking this research and bringing it to the attention of public authorities. It's not entirely clear what we do to encourage those organisations to make better use of the Act.
Okay, I mean, maybe that's something we need to follow up with them. And then my third point is kind of to follow up from Dr. Murray and others, the whole question of extending the number of bodies that could be included within the legislation. I mean, I take the point that the power is there. The fact that the power, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been used does make it a little bit kind of academic. But, I mean, is it not the case that as councils, for example, hive off parts of themselves, as has happened in Glasgow, then actually the amount of information being covered by FOI is reducing because big chunks of information are leaving the public sector and going into ALIOs or whatever we call them, trusts and so on. So, I mean, at the moment we seem to be contracting what is covered. So surely, even to stand still, it would be necessary to expand the number of bodies, would it not?
I think extension is ultimately a political decision, and the Scottish Minister's view on that is clear in terms of Scottish ministers have consulted, and the decision has been made to defer a decision on extension. Obviously, we've consulted with contractors, we've consulted with Glasgow Housing Association and various other bodies. Certainly take the point about ALIOs, etc., being hived off. Consultation on extension has not really shown significant, or indeed almost no evidence of unmet demand for information. And information should still be available in the majority of cases through the commissioning authorities, through the commissioning public authority. So there should still be a route to the information. After all, it is the commissioning authority who are responsible for funding these organisations. And certainly consultation has shown that as most people, most members of the public would prefer to go to the commissioning authority, the public authority, certainly as a first port of call to get the information.
I mean, I take the point that in some cases, that's right, I think Glasgow City Council has instructed some of its ALIOs to basically adhere to the legislation, although I don't think that's the case with Glasgow Housing Association. I'm not sure, because they're not quite so much controlled by the council. But I'm a little bit surprised that you say there's no evidence of unmet demand, because, I mean, some of us, for example, have been trying to find out about Glasgow City Council's PFI contracts with the private sector. And, I mean, the assumption has to be that the two organisations, the council and the private sector, are both embarrassed by the agreement and do not want it in the public domain. So, I mean, it is in neither of their interests to get it in the public domain, and we as the public have no way of getting access to it. And surely that's not transparency.
As far as I'm aware, Glasgow Housing Association operate in the spirit of the legislation. And I think this is one area where it will be interesting to see how the Scottish Housing Charter impacts in terms of the criteria and the outcomes that they are setting to make more information transparent, or to make more information accessible. And that's obviously something that's regulated by the Scottish Housing Regulator.
And what about the issue of, say, a contract between, you know, a council and the private sector where neither wants to let the public see about it?
Well, if the council holds a contract, obviously the council will be subject to the legislation, and the request process will follow the standard process. Obviously, if the council invoke exemptions, that is their right to do that. Then ultimately, it becomes a course of appeal to the Information Commissioner.
Yes, and if it's if there's a confidentiality agreement, then therefore the result of all that process is we do not get access to that. But I mean, surely the whole point of the thing is to make everything more transparent, is it not? Or
certainly, Scottish ministers are fully committed to transparency, but the decision on whether to extend to contractors to housing associations is ultimately a political decision.
Yeah, well, thank you. I shall raise these points with other people.
Thank you very much to committee members. I've still got some questions to ask. In terms of the lifespan of certain exemptions, the Scottish Government have said that they've had near universal support for the changes to the definition of historical records, but the Commission for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland have said, and I quote, "We are concerned that the level of flexibility proposed will lead to a more complex and less accessible freedom of information system." What's your response to that? And also, the issue of flexibility, in terms of financial memorandum, I don't really see much which suggests that introducing flexibility will be more, will cost more to implement. Is it your view that there will be a zero cost to that? And what is your view in terms of flexibility, in terms of the making it less accessible?
Certainly aware as a comment on increased complexity, and there's no denying, obviously, the more exemptions you remove from the blanket 30-year exemptions, and the more subsections, the more records you take out, will increase complexity. We're obviously committed to consulting on a draft order before putting that into effect. So that will give another opportunity to tease out any issues with complexity which public authorities may envisage. The feeling, though, is that there won't be a significant increase in level of complexity, and any increase that there is will be more than counterbalanced, more than outweighed by the gain in the increased public information that will be made public. So there is a balance to be met, which I would anticipate being teased out during consultation on the draft order. But allowing for a slight increased level of complexity, there will be more information made public, which is, after all, the ultimate goal. In terms of cost, sorry, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you a wee second, but I mean, it says, for example, that the information requests are estimated to cost the Scottish Government £236. So clearly, if there's an additional complexity, you know, there might be, you know, I was wondering whether that would add to the cost of delivery.
I think that's a slightly different issue. The calculated cost of information requested to the Scottish Government is £236. The fact that different exemptions will apply is unlikely to have significant, if any, impact on the number of requests coming into an organisation. So the costs, the overall costs of responding to FRI, I would have thought, are very unlikely to change. And which are obviously absorbed in day-to-day running costs of any public authority at present.
I thought that there would be additional costs simply because someone would be checking under which particular regime it would actually fall into. Alone would take time and therefore add to costs, surely.
There is potential for I would suspect minimal impact of that. But obviously the BREEA process should tease out any relevant cost implications. I think on the same point, it would also be important to stress that the intention to release further information is not necessarily proactive. If and when the order-making powers come in, it won't be necessarily the case that all public authorities who are now faced with different lifespan exemption lifespans will overnight be releasing information 15 years earlier than they might do at present. That will be entirely up to the individual public authority. It could well, in all probability, it will be reactive as proactive. It will be just in terms of when a request comes in that the new lifespans will be applied. So it won't be creating any more requests necessarily, but just slightly different rules and regulations apply when responding to the request. It will be entirely up to an individual public authority whether they take a proactive or reactive approach.
Okay, seems complexity in my view always seems to add to costs. But moving on to another bit, Universities Scotland expressed some concerns which were given to them by their own members, and which you'll be aware. And, for example, they've said, notwithstanding the exemption for ongoing research, any limit on a university's ability to accept information in conference for an extended period may prejudice its ability to secure access to such data and therefore its ability to conduct the highest quality research. Are you able to provide any reassurance to them that they will not have to have FOI reduced to 15 years, which may impact upon that in terms of under flexibility?
Well, as I think we set out in our proposals, we're obviously aware of concerns across the university sector, primarily in terms of research data, in terms of donations to libraries for research purposes. And partly for that reason, indeed largely for that reason, the Scottish Government is not proposing to change the lifespan of the Section 36 exemption, which deals with confidentiality.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for clarifying that. And just one final point, in the issue of the £236, how much does the Scottish Government currently spend in terms of responding to FOI requests in a year?
We most recently published cost data, I think in 2010, and I think that estimated cost to the Scottish Government in the region of about £500,000, but I can certainly get back to the committee.
And so that means there's about 2,000 odd requests a year, just over 2,000 requests a year?
It's just slightly under, yes, but I can certainly provide the committee with infinite detail on costing arrangements.
And obviously you're hoping that one of the benefits of flexibility and that people will be able to get information under 15 years or maybe 20 years would mean that people wouldn't have to then make so many requests. But surely most of the requests are made are fairly short term. I mean, people who put requests in the Scottish Government often want to find out information about things that happened 6 months or a year ago. Will there really be a significant difference? I mean, it says it's premature to identify long-term savings from the Scottish Government's policy of early release of information. But just to see, is there going to be a significant difference, do you believe?
I do not believe there will be a significant difference, exactly for the reasons you give. The vast majority of requests are for information, are for current information. And certainly, obviously, it's currently Scottish Government policy to release information now at 15 years rather than 30 years. Certainly as a general rule, the National Archives have been opening their files for the last 2 or 3 years at 15 years. And I don't think there is as yet any tangible evidence that a number of requests have come down.
I notice that although the Scottish Government, has tried to bring information into the public domain a lot earlier than it perhaps needs to under legislation. Well, that brings this evidence session to a close. We're actually 2 minutes ahead of schedule, despite fire alarms and what have you. I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming along this morning and for their contributions, and colleagues again for their questions. I'm just going to allow a 1 minute for a change of witnesses, and then we'll carry on with agenda item 5. But just before that, I'd just like to remind everyone that the committee will continue stage 1 scrutiny of the Freedom of Information Amendment Scotland Bill at its next meeting, when it holds its remaining 3 oral evidence sessions, including a session with the Minister, Brian Adam. We now turn to agenda item 5, our consideration of the financial memorandum to the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Scotland Bill. Can I welcome to the meeting from the Scottish Government Bill team, Colin Mackay and Ondine Tennant. I'm just wondering if you have an opening statement for us.
No, we don't have an opening statement. We're very happy to take questions.
Oh, God, straight into the questions then. Right, okay. I shall fire away then. I'm just, first, I just want to comment on some of the submissions by some of the people to consultation. For example, Consumer Focus Scotland. Consumer Focus Scotland have said in their evidence, and I quote, "We do not think that SCJC would be able to undertake the range of functions identified without significant additional resources being committed by the Scottish Court Service. And in its early life, the SCJC is likely to have a substantial workload preparing the rules required to implement the reforms of the civil courts." And then they go on to say, "We are disappointed that the remuneration of council members is not included in projected costs of the SCJC, despite such remuneration being permitted by the bill, and this may be a key means of opening up the membership to people not otherwise in a position to apply for such a cost." So I'm just wondering if you can comment on those points.
Certainly. I mean, on the first point about resourcing, I mean, obviously, the more resources that the Civil Justice Council has, the more it can do. And, you know, the costs that we have put in the financial memorandum as estimated costs, both for the Council to do its normal steady state functions and the projected costs for the implementation of the Civil Courts Review, should Parliament pass that legislation, are pretty frugal. And that just reflects the fact, of course, that public finances are under tremendous strain. So we've had to pare down the costs to what we think are really the minimum that would be necessary for it to have the impact that it needs to have. As I say, there are a whole host of issues around civil justice that a council, if it had more resources, could, I'm sure, very usefully devote time to. But given the difficulty in finding money for new functions, we feel that we've allowed enough resource to do the things that it needs to do. And I think Lord Gale, in his submission to the committee, has confirmed that he's content that within those parameters the financial details are reasonable. And we did work very closely with the Lord President's private office in developing the costs of the CJC. On your second point about remuneration of members of the Council, there hasn't been a tradition, as I understand it, of remuneration of the members of the current Sheriff Court Rules Council and Court of Session Council. We do recognise, and that's why the bill makes provision for it, that there could be situations where there are people who genuinely can't be expected to do this work for nothing. And so it may well be that the Lord President would be minded to provide remuneration for certain members of the Council. But I think the reality is that most of the people who will be on the Council will be doing it in some kind of connection with their professional or personal professional roles, for example, solicitors or advocates, and I'm not sure that we would want to, as we make a commitment at the moment, that these people would get paid, certainly not paid at the rates that they would normally expect to get paid for spending time. So I think it's going to have to be a balance that the Lord President is going to have to strike against the desirability of remuneration for some of the members of the Council against the other pressures on the Council's budget. I don't know if you've got anything more.
I would just add that we worked out how much the maximum remuneration might cost the Council over a year based on quite regular meetings, which would be once a month for council meetings and once a month for committee meetings. And assuming that the maximum of 12 eligible members for remuneration, the bill carves out certain members, such as the judiciary, from additional payment on top of their current salaries. We calculated that as possibly up to £72,000 a year. That would obviously depend on what the level of remuneration was set at. We used £250 just based on the current levels of other other remuneration, for instance, the Judicial Appointments Board, but that could be reduced if perhaps you were looking at a financial loss rather than a set payment. It's just to emphasise that it could range to quite high levels.
But some individuals potentially could get remuneration. But not
It's
all.
certainly possible under the bill.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the Scottish Court Service, they have said that Scottish Ministers' proposals should include consideration of the future costs associated with supporting the work of the SCGIC beyond its initial period of operation. I'm just wondering again if you have comments on that also.
I think the proposals do, because we've set out both, as it were, a steady state cost of the SCGIC, which is a modest increase above the current costs of the two existing rules councils to reflect the policy function that the SCGIC would take on, and then separately allowed for what we anticipate would be the cost of the major project of implementing the Guild reforms, should those be legislated for. Now, of course, at the back end of that, I mean, the Guild reforms will take several years to work through the system, and quite what the system looks like and quite what the civil justice system looks like in 6 or 7 years, I suppose, is difficult to estimate. But as far as we can, we've made an estimate of what the body doing the kind of things we think it needs to do would cost, either if we didn't legislate for GIL, although that's clearly the intention, or if or once the GIL work is completed.
Legal aid is obviously an important issue in terms of the likelihood that people are going to be asked to make a contribution. The Scottish Government considers that in the current financial challenging circumstances, those who can afford to contribute towards the cost of a criminal legal aid should do so. Introducing contributions would save up to £3.9 million. And looking at your figures, it seems to me that about 83% of people would not have to make contributions, and only those above a certain level of disposable income or capital will be asked to pay a contribution. But although I read through the documents and I saw some figures, I'm not entirely clear as to who would and who would not actually be asked to make a contribution. So I'm just wondering again if you can elaborate a wee bit more on the kind of levels we would be talking about. I realise that, this isn't, you can't give, obviously, hard and fast details because it takes into account individual circumstances and perhaps in terms of their family, etc. But what kind of family size and responsibilities and all this, but what kind of ballpark figure are we talking about for whereby people will have to make a contribution to their own costs in this?
Well, as you say, it's slightly difficult to express this because there are figures set out in the financial memorandum. These relate to the current figures which are used to assess contributions. I mean, as you'll be aware, people in receipt of civil legal aid are already assessed for a financial contribution, and indeed, in some criminal cases, people already pay a contribution if this is under what's called the ABWAR scheme, which is assistance by way of representation, and by and large, that's people who are pleading guilty rather than not guilty. So the idea of a contribution in the criminal system is not totally new. And using the kind of figures that are used there, although they've had to be adjusted so that we can harmonise the different schemes, the thresholds set out in paragraphs 158 to 159 of the financial memorandum are a disposable income of £68 is when you would start a week, is when you start paying a contribution, and unless there were particular circumstances where your disposable income was over £222, you would be ineligible for legal aid. Now, those figures sound quite stark, and I know it's created some anxiety within some members of the profession that people who are pretty poor would be paying a contribution. I think the point that's important to bear in mind is these are net figures for disposable income after various outlays are taken into account, and that would include things like childcare costs, mortgage costs, and or rental costs, and so on. I mean, it's difficult because everybody's outgoings are difficult, so I don't think we could give you a sort of, as it were, an average gross figure for what sort of money people would need to have coming in order to be eligible to pay a contribution. But it's, in most cases, it's likely to be substantially more than the £68 a week, because that is genuinely money that they have to dispose of, which could be used to contribute towards their costs.
Yes, I saw those figures under paragraphs 158 and 159. It was just that I was looking for a wee bit more information as to, you've said mortgage costs, childcare costs, but just people, I imagine, would want to know, I suppose, and they will be told exactly, if this goes through, whether or not they qualify or not for full legal aid. But I just wonder if you can give us just a wee bit more meat on the bones in terms of what is included and what is not included in terms of disposable income.
I doubt that I could give you much more just now beyond what's in the financial memorandum, and I should apologise. My colleague Karen McIver, who was the person who's working on the legal aid aspects of the bill, was due to give evidence today but is unwell. But we'd be very happy to give you details of what the board currently treat as outgoings, which would be taken off the calculation, so that you can get a clearer picture of what that would mean.
Well, thank you. Right. I'd now like to open the session out to colleagues, and the first person to ask questions would be Michael.
Thanks so much, Convener. Obviously, improving the civil justice system is something that everyone's going to sign up to. We want to see that. Fortunately, I've never experienced anything in terms of the courts, but I'm speaking to family members and friends who are either have been witnesses, jurors, or who earn a living in the court system. I'm aware that there is a concern that there is a lack of efficiency, that we need to get more value for money from our judicial system. And I also am aware that sometimes you have to spend to save, that there has to be some initial costs in order to get things operational, which in the fullness of time will achieve some savings. And the financial memorandum suggests that the first 2 to 3 years there would be increases, but thereafter there would decreases. We would start to see the types of efficiency that we would all want to see. But it is also concerning, though, that it says in the financial memorandum it's not possible to estimate the cost the new council incur in taking forward the rule changes for civil courts before the legislation in that regard is passed by the Scottish Parliament. How can you convince us that we're not buying a pig in a poke?
Well, I think when we say not possible, we've done the best we can to give fairly detailed estimates of how many staff would be needed to take forward the reforms as we understand them. I suppose the point we're making is that the Parliament may choose to legislate in a different way from what we currently envisage. I mean, the Government has set out a response to the Gill Review, and we've set out how we would intend to take those things forward, but clearly we don't know what will end up as legislation. So obviously we can't be entirely clear about what the outcome of that would be. That said, again, much of this depends not just on what's in the legislation, but how quickly you implement it and how you phase it. So, I mean, I think there is scope for the court service to manage and husband its resources in a way that will allow them to phase in their reforms over a period of time, should that be necessary. Our expectation is not that the costs would substantially exceed the kind of ranges that we've given, or that would really exceed to any appreciable degree the ranges given in the financial memorandum. We think that's adequate to implement the reforms. But as I say, we just have to caveat. I mean, the pig in the poke aspect, I suppose, is that it's not us that's going to be legislating for the bill, it's Parliament. So ultimately Parliament will approve the financial memorandum for the Courts Reform Bill, which will include whatever costs are to be borne as a consequence of the Courts Reform Bill, and that would obviously include any implications for the Civil Justice Council when that comes forward. I should say also that we're intended to introduce the bill as a draft bill for consultation before it's introduced to the Parliament, so there will be an extensive opportunity for all the stakeholders to consider what the implications of the changes would be.
To follow up, as I said, I understand that sometimes we have to have some initial costs. There's no question about that. It's whether what we've got to test is whether those initial costs will be around the area in which the financial memorandum suggests they will be, and that the ongoing costs are not going to miss the target. The convener has already referred to Consumer Focus's contribution to the debate. They have got some major concerns around this, because if we're going to have proper funding of the council in order to make the changes that are going to come about, then it may require that the figure that's initially involves in the set-up will be more than what the financial memorandum suggests it's going to be. Now, if that can be legitimised, if that can be argued for and therefore sustained, then that makes the memorandums more robust. It means that we've got more confidence in it. But Consumer Focus are saying that they don't believe that at the level at which the funding has been set, that the Council will be any more than a rule-setting body, which means it won't achieve the savings in the longer term that it's been set for it. So can you see the concern that if we don't get the financial costs right at the outset, regardless of how well the legislation is drafted, it won't meet its aims and we won't get the reformed and more efficient judicial system that we all want to see?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think so. I'm not aware that Consumer Focus identified any particular kind of comparisons or a basis other than just, I suppose, a general sense that this didn't seem to be as much as they might have hoped in order to really do the business. But I mean, we've looked at the costs of the current two rules councils, which we merged into this single body. We've looked at the cost of the Civil Justice Council in England and Wales as the best comparator and come up with what we think is, as I say, a relatively lean but kind of setup, but one that will have additional capacity to take forward changes in the rules. I think in terms of the investor safe point that you quite rightly make, the larger part of the investment for courts reform is not going to be in the Civil Justice Council. I mean, it's going to be in things like IT systems and judicial training and potential changes to the court estate. So in terms of the overall courts reform agenda, this is a very small element. And to be honest, I think any variation in the cost of the Civil Justice Council, because the Lord President might decide, well, you know, if it's going to take 3 years for this body to do its rules revision, we'd rather do it in 2 to get things going more quickly. We'll need to put more costs into the Civil Justice Council. The cost of those kind of, variations on the Civil Justice Council, I think, would be, completely swallowed up by the variations in cost about how much is it going to cost to buy a new IT system, for example, for the Scottish Court Service. So I think we've got enough flex in the system, both within the Scottish Court Service's overall budgetary provision and within the financial memorandum, to make sure that the Council will have sufficient resource to do the Guild reforms. And you'll have seen that the extra cost to do Guild is substantially more than the steady state cost of the Council. So we are talking about ramping it up fairly significantly over the next few years in order to implement the rules project. And that's been done by reference to the similar exercise that took place down south following the Wolf reforms, which are, on a broadly similar line to the Gill reforms. And I think Lord Gill, in his evidence to the Justice Committee, or was it to here? The Justice Committee has pointed out, obviously you can't always directly compare Scotland and England because the way their rules are constituted is different from the way that the rules work in Scotland. So there's some degree of uncertainty, but I think the range that we've given, we're reasonably confident gives enough money for the Council to do a decent job in bringing the rules up to date. I mean, essentially the Council job is to think about things, and we just need to get in the right people with the right brain power and the right analysis to do that thinking. It's not going to have large amounts of costs for equipment or buildings or any of the other things that can run away with themselves sometimes in terms of public sector spending. So, I think it's got enough people to think about things that it'll come up with the right solutions.
Yes, the point's been made that if there are extra costs, they will go on to court fees, and that will be paid by the users of the courts. And I mean, there's already a concern that people at the bottom get legal aid, people at the top have got lots of money, but a lot of people in the middle cannot access the courts. And therefore, I would be afraid that that number of people increases that cannot access the courts. I mean, is that a point that's being taken into consideration?
Yes, it has. I mean, I think it's obviously a concern around access to justice. I think on the detail of that, I think the first thing I would say about that, about the point about people in the middle not being able to access the courts, is that court fees are typically a very small part of the cost of any action. I mean, essentially, it's lawyers' fees that are things that cost people money and make court potentially expensive for people. So, you know, the relatively modest uplift in court fees is not going to be, I think, the deciding factor on whether or not people have access to the courts. The other thing I would say, as you said, that people with legal aid don't pay court fees. One of the things that this government has done is substantially extend eligibility to legal aid up the kind of income ranges so that people, you know, of moderate incomes can still access legal aid, particularly if they have a very expensive case. Now, there may be a contribution to pay, but it's the idea that they would be subject to huge financial risk is taken away. Now, that's obviously difficult to sustain that, given the pressures on public finances, but we have done so, and we've committed to trying to maintain that. So we don't think that the fees increases which the Scottish Court Service have consulted upon will significantly impact on access to justice, either for the poorest or for the people in the middle ranges.
Okay, well, thank you very much to colleagues for their questions, and thank you very much for your evidence today. Thank you. I'm going to move back now to item 1 on our agenda. As you recall, Elaine raised an issue with regard to going into private session. I just wonder if I can perhaps suggest that the committee agree to take items 6 to 10 in private today, but we consider our future approach to items in private a part of our discussion in the work programme, which we will be having later on this afternoon. Would that be okay? Everyone agree with that? Thank you very much. You may have noticed, members, that our clerical staff have been dropping like flies over the last hour. I therefore, in closing the public part of the meeting, will suspend the session until 12:30 in order that everyone who needs to can have a natural break.